calls for people to do these breakout sessions. Since this is the area in which I work, I'm a licensed professional counselor here in Delaware County. I'm the coach of the Olentangy High School team, but I thought that was a perfect time for me to throw my hat in the ring and offer some services that might actually benefit the community. That said, I will let you know that most of my practice is centered around adolescents, and that means children anywhere from the ages of about 11 or 12 up through college kids. So adolescence has a wider age range than it used to back in the day, but that's the primary client base that I see. I do see adults as well, but that's where my focus is. So I work with kids, obviously, in the high school setting. So there's that non-clinical work that I do, but otherwise it is clinical work with students. And I thought I'd start by, talking a little bit about what I saw going into the pandemic, and then talk a little bit about what I saw during the pandemic, and then how that seems to be affecting kids as we come out of the pandemic. So at any time, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. I'm trying to watch the chat, but I'm not the best at doing that. So it's probably best if you just turn your mic on and ask a question. So basically, going into the pandemic, I can keep it kind of short and sweet. Kids that would identify as introverts were thrilled with the beginning of the pandemic. Everyone thought it was going to be temporary. It was just going to be a few weeks. So it looked like an extended vacation of sorts. And the introverts were coming into the clinic and basically saying, great, now everybody's socially isolated for a little while, and this is how we sometimes like things and or often like things, so this is great. Now everybody's operating in our world. And the extroverts would come in, or the very social introverts as well would come in, and they were not very happy. They didn't like the disruption in their social lives. They didn't like the fact that they were being told they couldn't go out and see their friends, and they couldn't see people and go out of the house. So they took it relatively easy at first, but then it hit them harder sooner, I would say, once the pandemic was obvious that it was going to be in full swing, and it was going to be longer than a few weeks or a month. So that's basically what happened at the very beginning. And then I would say we hit panic mode, and we had a lot of, as teachers, you would know that kids that were normally, planners had a lot of problems because, they just watched the end of their school year disappear, especially if they were seniors in high school. And, there was a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, a lot of trying to adjust mentally, trying to adjust physically, trying to adjust socially, spiritually. I mean, really just across the board with adults and teens. There was a huge adjustment period, but with teens in particular, because they are generally social creatures, they were having trouble understanding why they couldn't finish out their school year and what the future was going to hold for them. So just that ambiguity caused a lot of stress and anxiety and depressive type symptoms in the clinic. I have a much longer list as far as, what was affecting people during the pandemic. And this, again, is going to be pretty similar across the board for adults and for teens, but there are some things that are specific to teens that really kind of hit home. I'll just start kind of going through my list here, and then if anybody has any questions, let me know. But as I mentioned before, the social isolation from peers was the biggest problem. I wanted to make sure that, what I was sharing with you today was consistent with some things that I was seeing in literature. So I got online and pulled up the CDC's website, and right off the bat found a quote or a piece from a report, a survey that they had done back in November of 2020, or I guess that's when they published it, but they were reviewing data from January of 2020 through October of 2020. And I will just read what I found here. It says, many mental health disorders commence in childhood, and mental health concerns in these age groups, the age group being 5-year-olds to 17-year-olds, might be exacerbated by the stress related to the pandemic and abrupt disruptions to daily life associated with mitigation efforts, including anxiety about illness. So in other words, anxiety about spreading the disease, or spreading the COVID, thank you, social isolation and interrupted connectedness to school. So right off the bat, there was support that what kids were having to adjust to was, what is this disruption in our social life look like? And it was pretty severe. Kids do have social media. They're on social media a lot more than adults, I would say. But and that is definitely a strong form of connection for them. But seeing kids every day in school, just that visual piece wasn't there. Kids don't talk on the phone like some of us older individuals used to back in the day, so weren't necessarily hearing the voices. Their connection was mainly limited to Snapchat, Instagram, and Discord, and a lot of the gaming systems. The kids consider that the social connection for them. So as they were plunged into that, they also then were faced to deal with what were the parental responses to that. So parental responses were generally, you can't go anywhere, you can't do anything, and why are you spending so much time online? So I know that I spent a lot of time educating parents or talking to parents about that social media piece, and trying to help parents avoid cutting off social media altogether for their kids because they felt their kids weren't getting schoolwork done or weren't getting out of bed on time or had a complete lack of motivation. So there's definitely an education piece that comes with all of this from the parent side of it. So that's something that we want to keep in mind going forward as teachers and coaches, is that sometimes we will have to reach out, as you all know, I'm sure, to the parents and do a little bit of education as to what's going on. So the social isolation was huge. Oops, lost my track. Second thing here I have was, teens started to seek comfort in social media. So if that's your sole form of communication for a few months or even longer, then naturally you're going to be maybe branching off into different areas of social media or even the internet in general, that they didn't do that before. So I had quite a few kids, especially females, that would come in and were really looking up things, answers, I would say, to some of the identity questions that they were having or social questions that they were having. They'd see things on social media and then they might go research it or explore it on the internet. And then that was raising even a lot more questions for kids. So I'll just kind of leave it general at that. We can probably go into that a little bit later. Some of the other things, a drop in motivation I mentioned, that was a real point of contention, obviously, between parents and kids, because the things that I heard, the statements that I heard were, why should I bother to get up at 8 a.m. if I have 2 hours of homework and no class today? So there was, that disconnect. Even when some of the schools went to the hybrid settings, it was still only 2 or 3 days a week that the kids were actually at school. And kids tended to view it as, I have a day off, or I have 2 to 3 days off a week. I'm going to get a job, or I'm going to go hang out with friends, or I'm going to sleep in. And parents were trying to view it still as, no, we're trying to keep some sort of normalcy going at home. And it just became a real struggle between parents and kids. And that's, kids started to get behind in schoolwork. I'm sure as teachers, you saw that. The frustration with trying to make sure that kids were getting everything that they needed online, but that they were also showing up for instruction, that they were understanding what they were reading. I heard a lot from both teachers and kids, because I did have some teachers come in during that time as well, but that communication was a huge problem. If kids had questions, they'd try to reach out via email, and the teachers were inundated with emails, and so it might take time getting back to them. And it just became a really frustrating process on both ends, not to mention when parents would get involved. So I heard quite a bit of disconnect from the real world. It was described as maybe similar to disassociation, where not necessarily that they were stepping outside of their own bodies and kind of watching things happen, but they definitely felt a disconnect between reality. So I heard this a lot about kids that when they went back to college or when they were at college, if they stayed there on campus, they said it didn't seem real. It didn't seem like, the same as last year when I was highly engaged. I don't know why I'm here. I just feel really disconnected, was the word that I heard. Not to a pathological sense that they were, splitting off completely from reality, but in the sense that there was some sort of a disconnect and they were having trouble um, feeling like they belonged there. And let's see, existential thoughts. Obviously, with all of this, with the whole pandemic, and maybe this was with adults as well, but I heard it with kids, what's the purpose of all of this? There was a lot of thinking that, we all might die from this, or a good chunk of us could die from this. And, the kids were seeing, you know, maybe a grandparent pass away or somebody else pass away, and they're hearing the stories. And so there was a lot of this, what is the purpose of life? Which is a pretty heavy question for kids this age, in high school and middle school. Um, but I did hear it quite often. So we would have those conversations, which I would encourage you to do. Never shy away from conversations with kids about these things. If they're bringing them up, then it means they're on their mind. So I encourage you to talk with them and hear them out and listen to where their thoughts go. Let's see. Yeah, so stronger, I put a stronger than usual push or draw from parents. So some kids during this time felt that family time was wonderful. They were grateful for the added family time, even though it could be stressful now and then. They were grateful to be able to be with parents and siblings. It's almost as though they recognized this was an opportunity they probably weren't going to have again. And then other kids and families really just had a tough time being at home all the time with one another, even if they liked each other. And that became really evident with kids that did not have a healthy home life, whether there were issues of abuse or maybe things at home were semi-normal prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic exacerbated issues at home. So it became really tough for kids to navigate that. And so sometimes they would push back harder against parents than they might normally. Let's see. Yep. I saw this more than I would have. I don't know if I want to say more than I would have thought, but I definitely saw a few kids who were what I would say were on the extreme end or abnormal end of their concern for their spread of COVID. So, for example, I had a college age kid there were some other complicating issues behind it in his family that helped develop this view that he had, but it was definitely towards the more extreme end of where he used the word, I'm worried about murdering people if I don't wear a mask because I'm going to spread COVID. So taking a what we would call a healthy level of concern, and it went to an extreme. I had another young client who was a high school aged, actually middle school age client, who had a similar concern, this concern of, I am going to kill grandma, I can't see my grandma. So there was the stress of not being able to see grandma. And then on the flip side, but if I do see grandma, is that going to be harmful to her? So that was something else, to keep in mind that we had to balance with kids and what their perceptions were of the pandemic and, what level they were taking it to. Rigid, that generally both of those clients, and I would say in some of the others that took things a little bit more to the extreme end, were very concrete thinkers, very, very right and wrong, good and bad. So there wasn't a lot of gray area in between to be able to understand, that maybe there was some middle ground there. And then let's see. Oh yeah, as I mentioned before, family struggles were exacerbated. So if there was already something going on in the family, it generally just got worse. Personally, I tried to stay in the clinical setting with clients. There was about 4 or 5 weeks where I was doing telehealth, but I was very conscious about getting back into the clinical setting as soon as possible, because one of the issues that younger kids face that adults don't in general is that they don't have the ability to take themselves out of the home unless they drive. But even if they drive, they still need parent permission generally to go somewhere, but they didn't have the ability to have that same privacy as an adult might be able to create. So I had kids that would go and be in their car. If we were doing telehealth, they would, call me from the car and we would do telehealth that way. Or I had kids that, I finally said, like, let's just come on in. It's okay. We'll make it a safe place. There really weren't too many people rattling around in my office anyway. And I was vaccinated. So by that point, I had to get the kids back in. I had to have them see that there was still some sort of normalcy, that they could have a face-to-face conversation. And while COVID was a concern, mental health, from my perspective, mental health was a bigger concern for kids this age because of the stats and the things that I was seeing. So that's kind of what was going on prior to the pandemic, or just going into it, and then during the pandemic. I think one of the pieces that I want to mention for that as well is, and I did miss this, was grief and loss. Okay. There were a lot of kids that had grief and loss prior to the pandemic. They understood grief and loss, or they understood it from the sense that they had experienced it at some point in their life. And so going into the pandemic and hearing on the 24/7 news cycle that, people were identified with COVID, people were diagnosed with COVID, and that people were dying, there was a very strong sense in kids of feeling guilty if they were to see a family member, or if they were to do something anything really outside of the house. So that grief and loss that they had from prior experience carried into the pandemic, and then, became even larger. Not even the kids that took it, to the extreme, like I can't take my mask off or I'll murder somebody, but kids that were just so anxious about it, and there were a lot of discrepancies among families, with what they were comfortable with. So if a kid was on social media and saw that other kids were allowed to go to a friend's house, but their parents weren't letting them go somewhere, then they had FOMO, right? Fear of missing out would kick in, and it would be very much, why can they do it? Why can't I do it? Or why are they doing it? And then anger would pop up. So there were a lot of emotions flowing of anger, frustration, confusion, guilt, a lot of that coming into the clinical setting. And so that's what I talked through a lot with kids. And then just trying to get them back into some sort of a normal structure. So this is going to probably come up later as we talk about coming out of a pandemic, because there is still a lot of this lingering inability for kids to structure their days in a way that is helping them get back into normal. I used to see this prior to the pandemic. I used to see challenges with structure of their day when kids would transition from high school to college. College kids would come in and say, oh my gosh, my day is just, I have nothing to do. I go to 4 classes, max a day. And some days I don't even have classes and I don't know what to do with my time, but I'm not getting my work done. I'm so used to high school structure that transition then to college was difficult for them. So we would work on laying out their weeks and things like that. And what does a typical week look like? And have you scheduled in, balance with exercise and friends, but make homework time, that kind of thing. Well, with the pandemic, kids in high school went from that very structured day to nothing, like a very structured, busy day to nothing. So if they had extracurriculars, gone. If they, hung out with friends, gone. If they just like to exercise on their own outside or play with friends, gone, right? So it was all gone, went from all to nothing. And so now, as we're, trying to come out of this pandemic, or at least return to some sort of normalcy, kids are having trouble now going back to the early morning school start. They're having trouble with things like, why do I have to be at school? You know what? I don't even like chemistry class. I hear that a lot about chemistry and Spanish for some reason, but I don't even sorry if anyone's a chemistry or Spanish teacher, but I don't even like chemistry, and I'm not going to do anything with chemistry. So why do I have to take chemistry? So still some of those questions about, not existential questions, but questions about life and future life and what's the purpose of some of the stuff I'm doing. So I hear that school seems really crowded. Even though we don't have any more kids than we did prior to the pandemic, it just feels really crowded. And a lot of those kids were very used to the half class sizes, kids keeping their distance, masks were fine because then, nobody can see the acne on my face, that kind of a thing. But now, we're kind of right back at it. So it seems very overwhelming to quite a few kids. Also coming out of the pandemic, is it safe to go back? There's that confusion again. Heard this mostly from young college kids, but have also heard it from high school kids. If I go back and it's quote unquote normal, is it going to stay that way? So that fear of not knowing what's going to happen. And while a lot of adults struggle with that too, but our brains are fully developed. Mostly, our brains are fully developed, and we're able to make those adjustments generally a little bit easier than adolescents are. But since they no one's ever experienced this before, but since they don't know what's going to happen, it sort of triggers them into what happened back in March of, what was it, 2020, when they said, oh, we know what's going to happen, and then it didn't turn out that way, and then every piece after that was filled with ambiguity, and so that causes a lot of anxiety and stress for kids, and it continues to do that for quite a few kids. Yeah, right down here, they have a fear that it will turn into last year. Let's see, if kids are planners, if they've always liked that ability to plan, again, the anxiety is coming out because they don't have the option to plan. So I'll do a lot of work with kids on dividing. Grab a sheet of paper, divide it down the center. On the left side goes the things that are in my control, and on the right side gets a list of things that are not in my control, right? And once we have that clearly separated out and they have it as a visual in front of them, we cross out the things I don't control, and we're going to focus on the things that we do control. And that also allows kids to see that there are things that they control. This whole experience with the pandemic has led a lot of people to believe that everything is out of our control. Right? The pandemic means we don't control who's going to be healthy and who isn't. The government controls that we're not going to be able to leave our house, or that we're going to have to wear a mask, or I'm going to have to get vaccinated, right? This sense of having any control over anything has sort of escaped a lot of people. So I think it's really important, to the extent that we can, to give kids that sense of being in control again, and letting them know that there are things that they can control. Sense of autonomy. Let's see. Moving out of the pandemic. Oh yeah, back up here. So I mentioned family challenges before. That is still going on. There is still a sense with some kids of feeling that they are trapped in their household, or trapped in a situation that they have to answer to mom and dad for anything, that they can't really picture what the future is going to look like. So I do a lot of future picturing with kids, where I let them describe what it looks like, and really just kind of start that process in their brain, because maybe their brains have never done that before. But that's to try to shake loose some of that feeling of being stuck that they have going on. Again, grief and loss comes up. We had kids that lost, they lost school dances. They didn't get to say goodbye to favorite teachers. Kids in college that were graduating, I never got to say goodbye to my favorite professor. So there was a lot of loss of relationships in that sense. There might just be a loss of, my friend and I don't agree on, what proper protocols are for COVID. Saw a lot of family disruptions, a lot of family arguments, and family breakups, in the sense, maybe extended family and a immediate family would no longer talk to each other. So kids were experiencing that with friends. We're experiencing that with friends as well. And then if there was a kiddo that would sort of slip into a depression or anxiety, they might disconnect from social media for a while. Then the friend on the other end is like, well, what happened? Are they okay? That type of thing. So it's a lot of grief and loss in all different forms going on, not just loss, physical loss of a family member or a friend, but also emotional loss of friendships and other things. And let's see, coming out of the pandemic, I reached out to a friend of mine who is a therapist in the schools, working in the schools, and asked her what she's seeing. And now she works at elementary and middle school level, but I asked her about middle school level, because it's usually pretty similar to high school. And she said that she is seeing a lot of push right now, where parents are really stressing their kids out in terms of schoolwork. You know, you've missed a whole year basically of school, or they, at least parents feel like they have. And, you know, college is coming up or high school's coming up, whatever the next step is. And there's a concern that they are going to be behind. And it's almost as though it's taken out of context, you know, because within context, it's everybody went through this, right? So all the kids were missing that one-on-one, face-to-face school time. So, you know, but parents are kind of in a panic. Parents are seeing some of the struggles that kids are having with resuming normal structure of their school day and of their extracurriculars and their social life. And so parents are kind of going into a little bit of a panic. That's coming off on kids as high anxiety, high stress. I have a couple of kids that are just paralyzed by it. Can't, you know, not really taking classes that are overly challenging for them. We would consider it a normal workload for them, but just paralyzed by it. Even coming out of this, even though they're back in school and they're, you know, in the classroom seeing the teacher and can ask questions, it is still paralyzing to them. So a lot of the parents I see are pretty understanding, but I know that there are those challenges out there. And Rachel said that that's what she's seeing most of when she's in the classroom setting. So she has to do a lot of parent education, as well as what's a normal, reasonable expectation for kids during this time as they're coming out of the pandemic. Do I still have everybody? Everybody still with me? Okay. Let's see. So I put down here, what can adults do? So we're the adults in their lives, right? Whether we're a parent, a coach, a teacher, you know, what are the things that we can do? Keeping in mind, or at least I'm trying to keep in mind, that I know that we are all stressed and overworked as well. Peter and I were mentioning that at the beginning. There's just a lot going on right now. We went from a lot to nothing back to a lot. So, you know, we have to, as adults, since we do have our fully formed brains, we're supposed to be able to handle these things a lot better than the kiddos are. So I've just, you know, I do this myself. Try to remember to keep in mind that as hard as it is on us, it's even harder on the kids. So two things that I guess I would ask us to do in general as adults is, number one, when we're working with kids, just like we do when we're judges, if we enter a speech and debate competition, you know, we're supposed to check our bias at the door. We're supposed to not come in with any preconceived, you know, notions of who might do better, or what our preferences are in terms of politics or anything else. I'm going to ask the same thing of adults. And when you're working with kids is, you know, when they come to you, if they come to you, and hopefully they will, but if you know, you're blessed with that opportunity and they come to you, make sure you listen to them. Okay, make sure that you kind of set your own filter aside. We all have our own mental filters. Set your mental filter aside and try to do that active listening, where you're really hearing what the student or child is saying, rather than preparing, you know, the teacher speech or the coach speech or the parent speech, you know, and saying, I know what the right answer to this is. We want to meet the kids where they are, not, you know, try to pull them into where we are. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I've got an example. I had a parent of a client reach out today and say, what should I be doing with my student? You know, he's at home, we've pulled him out of school, he's having trouble, you know, doing his schoolwork, but we also don't want him to get behind. The more he gets behind, the higher the anxiety goes. So I said, okay, you've got to meet him where he is. I was glad she asked that. I was glad she wasn't, you know, hammering him to get it done. But I said, okay, talk to him about, you know, help him to organize the schoolwork, help him to break it down into smaller chunks. The kids come in with these ideas of this is just so overwhelming in their heads. They don't really maybe have the skills to sit down and organize it. And then when you sit down and organize it with them, weed out the stuff that's not important. Is there work that's busy work? Is there stuff that's really just not that important for the learning process? And there is stuff that's not that important. So, you know, weed that out. And then one task at a time. Here's one homework assignment for a class that you love. Let's get that done. Okay, done with that, go take a break, right? Here's the next homework assignment for maybe a class you don't like as much, but let's get that one done. Okay, cross off the list, set it aside. Again, go have a break, go have a rest, have something to eat, run around the house, whatever. Okay, and then come back. So if you can help them break things down into little chunks. So that's an example of meeting the student or the child where they are in their head, with their head being overwhelmed, versus where we are, where we're panicked that they're going to fall behind in school. Okay. As adults, Oh, I had said I had two things. So yeah, so not coming in with our biases, trying to meet the kids where they're at. And then also remembering that each student is unique and their set of circumstances is unique. So you could have two kids come to you with what appears to be the same problem, right? Falling behind in schoolwork. But if we don't take the time to have even just a 2-minute conversation with them where we're listening to what they're saying and we're also listening and observing what they're not saying, um, we might find that those two kids have completely different circumstances. One kid might just be trying to get out of work, right? It happens. Uh, or making an excuse for why they didn't turn something in. But the other kid might have something really stressful going on at home. You know, maybe a parent is sick, or maybe the parents are in the middle of a divorce, or there could be something else going on. So I'm just asking that we, ratchet up our listening skills, our adult brains, and really try to meet the kids where they are and remember that they are in unique circumstances. And just because we have a preconceived notion of who they are or where they are doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going on. Okay, so those were the main two things I want adults to keep in mind going into this. So what can we do? So just as all kids are unique, COVID was not a one-size-fits-all experience, even though the mantra was, we're all in this together. Yes, we were all in it together to a certain extent, but we were not all in it together under the same circumstances. Okay, so keep that in mind. This also goes along with the whole, our preconceived ideas of what should go on. Here's an example. Hopefully this will be relatable or transferable to what I'm about to say. But so in my office, we received an email I would say probably early this year, actually, in 2021 or mid 2021, sort of towards the closer end of the height of the pandemic. We all received an email from our landlord basically saying, hey, just remember, masks have to be worn inside, da 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 da. And I responded with, yes, generally that is true. Masks have to be worn inside. However, we are a mental health where we have 3 mental health professionals working in this building, and we have clients that have experienced PTSD or some sort of other trauma, and wearing a mask is not an option for them. And so that was just like my reminder, kindly, that this is not a one size fits all, pandemic, and it's not affecting everybody in the same way, and the fixes or the way to come out of it are not the same for everybody either. So again, when you're with your students, remember that. Try to bring, definitely we all have our own points of view, but we want to make sure that we're helping these kiddos the best way that we can, and it's not going to be a one size fits all cure for that. Acting out. This was interesting. So this was something that I feel like I've been hearing, maybe less in the clinical setting, but more when I'm at the school with my kiddos. But I reached out to my daughter who's in high school and I said, would you say that this is a true statement? I said, I feel like kids are going through an acting out period, sort of this, woo, I'm free. I'm going to let out all this pent up, whatever that I've had for the last 15 months. And before I could even finish getting it out of my mouth, she said, oh, definitely. So there is some of that going on. We want to remember that they are kids. While we won't condone, obviously, anything that's dangerous or unsafe, I think it would be really important right now to kind of keep in mind that we want to give them the benefit of the doubt. We want to give kids second chances. We want to give kids opportunities to, develop the prefrontal cortex and make better decisions. We want to do that any way that we can, whether that's, just a quiet admonishment or, a lesser discipline, or whether that is something where we just say, hey, I'm going to pull you aside, not in the middle of class, but after class when all the other kids aren't watching, because that causes a ton of anxiety for kids as well. But, hey, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about what's going on, and let me let you know what my expectations are, right? And with a tone of voice that they get the picture. Generally, kids respond a lot better if we're not yelling at them. If we're having conversations with them, they tend to listen better, because then if we're yelling at them, they exercise what they do best, which is just push up against us. Okay. And then all they are focused on is the pushing against us part. But if we have conversations with them with calm tones of voice, they're often forced to sit back and be like, oh yeah, right? I don't have her to yell at, so I have to sit here and think, maybe I have to think about what I did. So in general, that works better with kids. So giving them that second chance and that opportunity to sort of back out of whatever the behavior was that they were engaged in. Obviously, if it's a safety behavior or endangers, any themselves or anybody else, we have to deal with it how we have to deal with it. But pay attention to the quiet kids. I feel like this is a general statement, but a lot of the kids that come in to see me are the quiet kids. They're the kids that feel they don't cause trouble. They don't speak up. Oftentimes they don't know how to verbalize what's going on with them emotionally. And, they're more of the observer types. They're seeing everything that goes on in school. They're seeing what goes on social media. They have questions about it, but they don't know who to ask. So I get a lot of kids that come in because they feel like they want to talk about things that they can't talk about with their parents. Not that they've got parents that don't listen, but they just want a third party, outside person who's not going to pass judgment, who's going to answer some questions for them. But they're generally quiet kids. So quiet kids, it's easy to let them go by unnoticed. So I would, recommend that you maybe check in with those kids a little bit more than you might during a normal year. Ask open-ended questions. This comes back to the brain development. When kids hit high school, I talk to parents about the 80-20 rule, about listening 80% of the time, talking 20% of the time. Again, if we talk at them, they will push back, and generally none of those seeds will be planted. But if we ask the open-ended questions, so the questions that they can't answer with yes and no, but where they have to give full sentences or at least partial sentences, we're working on developing the decision-making part of the brain. We're working on having them have to think through either what they've done or what they want to do. Generally, again, if we remain calm, that's going to be more effective. So as teachers and coaches, we can do this, and you probably already do this better than parents do, but work on those open-ended questions and getting those kids really thinking about their decisions. Empathy. You don't have to be an extremely empathetic person to display empathy. That can come down to, just the way, nodding, making some noises as if you're listening, repeating what you hear them say, so I hear you saying this, right? We don't have to all be born incredibly empathetic in order to practice empathy. Normal things, look for major changes. Any of the kids have a major change in their friend groups, any major changes in grades dropping. Are they dressing differently? Are they behaving differently? Were they normally outgoing and now they're quiet, or vice versa? But just kind of keep those normal things that we would look for on high alert. Oh, I think I mentioned this earlier, but any opportunity that we can have to provide children with an opportunity to make choices for themselves or to be able to express themselves. So an example of what they did at our school, which I thought was fabulous, even though it wasn't necessarily executed well, but they let the kids paint their own parking spots this year. So they paid an extra $15 when they bought their parking passes. I don't know why they did that, probably so they can pave over it next year, although I would think the kids could just paint over it next year. But so the kids were able to express themselves artistically and paint a parking spot. Oh, seniors, by the way, it was just seniors. So giving them that added benefit of a way to express themselves, it's legal graffiti, I guess, if you want to call it that way. And it gave them a chance to just go and do something fun and have a sense of normalcy and kind of also feel like they were doing something wild and crazy. They got to post it over social media. So, as long as they kept it clean, they were allowed to do that. So just little things like that where kids can get an opportunity to be quote unquote normal again, and feel like they have some autonomy in their lives. I talked about second chances already. Yeah, this was kind of a little bit outside the box thing. Again, I spoke with my daughter and I said, is there anything else that you would want me to let teachers and coaches know? And she said, yeah. She said, I think they should be really careful about calling on kids unexpectedly in class. Well, I'm old school, so I didn't really see a problem with it. I figure if it happens once, maybe they'll be prepared the next time. But that's also not what I'm seeing in a clinical setting. Because a lot of kids that come in to see me have anxiety, have always had anxiety, and will continue to have anxiety. Hopefully we'll reduce that. But one of the biggest fears that kids have is being called on unexpectedly, because if I don't have the answer, I'm going to look dumb, or if I got called on, it means that I'm doing something wrong, or just that being a teen and being called on, called out, and the face just goes red and they go blank and they can't say anything. I realize with speech and debate students that might not be the case all the time, but for other kids, it can be. They don't want to speak out loud. They don't want to say things out loud. So I'm not going to say don't call on them, because I don't think that that's fair either in a learning environment, but maybe just try to structure it a little bit differently. If you see a kid goes into that deer in the headlights look when you call on them, maybe have a talk with them afterwards. For some kids, I know teachers have done things like try to restructure the way they do things. If a kiddo has an oral presentation, they might have them, maybe, let's say they've got 3 during the year. I hear this a lot with foreign languages. Maybe have they come in and they just do it for the teacher the first time around. And then maybe they can do it for the class, or at least, ask them to do at least a minute of it. Maybe it's a 2-minute speech, have them just do a part of it for the class. But take that anxiety piece again and break it down into smaller, more digestible chunks for them. So there is something, called exposure therapy with anxiety. For example, if somebody's extremely afraid of spiders, they have a phobia of spiders, we might start with just talking about spiders. And then once they're comfortable talking about a spider, we might look at picture books with spiders in them, but it's a step-by-step process that you build up to where maybe they're never going to hold the spider in their hand and pet it and call it George, but they are going to be okay if there's one across the room, and okay, that's fine, I'm not going to scream and I'll just leave the room and I'm okay. So it's a slow build up. Same thing, that works well with anxiety, and with kids, to just sort of throw them in if they've never had to speak before can be really triggering and difficult for them. So anything that you can do as a teacher or a coach to break it down. Maybe you have a new student to speech and debate and you're working on bringing them out of their shell. Give them those smaller chunks and see if they can accomplish those and build up to something bigger, which you guys might even have better recommendations on that than I have. I get a ton of kids that, again, I know it's difficult when they're returning to school to have them leaving the classroom, but in certain instances, I will have discussions with the guidance counselors or with the school or with parents to say, hey, can that kid get a get out of class free pass, where they don't have to make a big deal, they don't have to raise their hand and ask, but they get a pass. The understanding with the student is that they're going to leave, go down to the guidance counselor's office or the office in general, and they're going to sit there for a few minutes, and then they're going to return to class. Because the goal is to keep the kids in class, in school, in the extracurricular as long as possible for the time that they're supposed to be there, and minimize that time that they go and isolate. Or leave early and go home maybe from school. So if there's anything like that that you can work out with them, gladly. Obviously, if they start to violate the privilege, then that's going to be an issue. But fidget toys in class, quiet fidget toys. I will recommend sometimes silly putty, so the kids have something that's got tension in it, or I don't even know if they do the Cairo-filled stress balls, but something that's got a little bit of tension so that they have something to squeeze and sort of work out their frustration or their anxiety through. Some kids like certain textures. There are those little fidget toys. I can't remember what they're called. I call them poppers. Sometimes they make noise, but you can get them so that they don't make as much noise, but just so that the kids have an activity for their hands. I also talk about grounding activities. I recommend that kids do these. They can do it sitting in class, and it doesn't have to disturb the class or the teacher, but I talk to them about, pick an object in the room. Teachers' classrooms are full of tons of objects of interest. So I say, pick a particular object and focus on that object and think about what it looks like, describe it with your eyes, think about what it would smell like, think about what it would feel like. What would it taste like if it was something you could eat? And then what would it sound like if I shook it or dropped it on the floor or something like that? But to really engage with all 5 senses on whatever that object is. And then when you're done, if you feel like that's helped you calm and focus, then you can return to focusing on what the teacher is saying. Also talk about muscle relaxation. They can do easy muscle relaxation when they're sitting in class. They can scrunch up or tense each part of their body, starting with their toes, working all the way up to their calves and, rear ends, shoulders, hands, and they can just sort of tense them for a few seconds, then let them go and kind of shake them out, and do this a couple times and shake them out. And it's really going to help them to focus on their body, where they're tense right now, what's going on. It's a form of a grounding exercise as well. But the idea is that when they get done, they might be able to sit there and feel a little bit more loose while they're in class. They can do breathing exercises. I talk to kids about square breathing: in for a count of 3, hold for a count of 3, out for a count of 3, nothing for a count of 3, and then start over again. They can do that in class and nobody has to pay attention or know that they're doing it. I also do the breathe in half as long as you breathe out. So if you breathe in for a count of 1, you'll breathe out for a count of 2, breathe in for a count of 2, breathe out for a count of 4, that type of a thing. So these might be things that you could even introduce at the beginning of a class for 2 minutes. And if it provides one kid the chance to calm down and stay in class, then that would be worth it for the 2 minutes you take. So again, that's something that you can think of on your own, but it's just a recommendation. And let's see. Yeah. I think that's what I had. Let me see, I'm gonna look at my head together some case studies, but I think I mostly talked about these. I think speech and debate is a fabulous activity for kids right now. I think it was last year during the pandemic, even though it was an online format, at least it was something that was taking place. And, our team had enough online social activities that the kids really felt a sense of being connected to a certain extent with one another. This year, I don't know how everyone else is doing it. We're doing in-person meetings, and I cannot get the kids to go home. I mean, they sit there and I stand there and I actually say, okay, it's time to go, you can go, and they don't go anywhere. So that just is, again, reaffirming that the social connection is a huge piece for them and something that they really need. So if I had to recap everything, I guess it's just really be in tune to the kids, try to meet them where they are, and leave all of our junk, elsewhere. We can go talk to other adults about our stuff, but let's try to really pay attention to the kids this year. Pay attention to the quiet kids. Give the kids the opportunity to exercise their brains and think through their own decisions and their own problems, and give them the opportunity to verbalize what it is they're feeling. If they're more of a visual person and want to write it down, I encourage you to have them write it down. But really just kind of be there for them this year as we're coming out of this, and a lot of kids are still struggling. Honestly, I didn't imagine it would be as difficult as it has been for some kids. Other kids are thriving. This isn't to say all kids are struggling. Other kids are thriving. They like, oh yeah, we're back, we're good. I'm wearing a mask, I don't care, whatever. So kudos to them for that. But yeah, so that's what I'm seeing. It's what I've seen. Anyone have any questions? Also, since I know this is being recorded, if somebody does have a question, I will go ahead. I assume they can see what I put in the chat thing here, but I will go ahead and put my email address so that if people want to send questions. My email address, and I will put my it's my number, but it's not my number. If they call it, it's going to look like it comes through Psychology Today. But in case anybody has any questions, sorry, I'm blind. I'll put that. Okay.
Yeah, and in the editing process, I can add that so that it pops up too.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
I know I've been seeing a lot of students that have regressed in conflict resolution skills, especially our special needs students.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also seeing some students that have lived in fear, not from their own standpoint, but from things that their parents have perpetuated at home. Specifically, we had a family where they did lose a pregnancy years ago. Right at the start of the pandemic, mom found out she was pregnant, and the family basically lived in fear until everyone could get vaccinated, and it was basically almost a full year.
Yeah. So that, I don't know if the correct word is vicarious or not, but they are, when they're at home and their only exposure to human beings in person are mom and dad and the family, then those, whatever those beliefs are, those core values that they have, are going to be amplified. They're going to be magnified. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of that. I'm glad that you brought up you know, the kids. So socially, emotionally, there is some regression. If there wasn't regression, then there at least was a standstill. And I think some of that comes with the issue I was talking about before about, I called it acting out, but it's almost more of just, I don't know how to act, or I don't remember how to act in a social setting. And especially, yes, with kids with special needs, I would think, if they're not having that constant reminder of their peers, acting a certain way, or they're not able to interact with one another, then yes, some of that would go out of the brain or the learning ability. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm seeing that even in kids that are not special needs. It's we held a camp at our school. So we had eighth graders and freshmen, and they were taking off just running through the schools. And I mean, they slammed into to a guidance counselor, and it was just like, come on, you're not third grade, right? You're supposed to be older and act differently. But just, and they got it afterwards. When somebody came down and talked to them about it, they got it. Unfortunately, the person came down and yelled at them, and then I had to talk to them about it. But again, that's just keeping in mind, taking everything with a grain of salt, and understanding that this process was a setback for a lot of people, and it was also then just a stationary point for others, and they didn't have the growth that we would expect over that year. So yeah, and parental influences are big. And again, we don't want to, I know in a clinical setting, I don't go in and contradict parents. I don't go in and say what your parent said is wrong. I talk through it with the kids to kind of see where they are. And then I work from there. And then if I need to speak to the parents, I'll talk to the parents, and I do the same thing. I don't come at them and say, gosh, what are you doing to this poor kid? I'll meet them where the family is at. In that example, if there was a loss, a miscarriage, we're going to realize that there's some grief and loss in there, definitely grief and loss in there. And so there's going to be, a bigger challenge to overcome or to work through than somebody that hadn't experienced that grief or loss.
So I have a question. Um, it's kind of on the opposite side, going back to maybe some of those kids that you talked about at the very beginning who were introverted and who really, I don't know, preferred almost online school and being at home. Um, do you see some kids who have gotten so comfortable, like being at home and not having much social contact, and like they just want to stay kind of in that cocoon sort of, and like they would prefer, not to go back to school if they could, and not to return to sort of normal social activities. um
I would say I've almost seen that more in adults that have come in
hmm
than the kids. Now, if it's a kid that's like that, it's almost this inexplicable, like if you ask them to put words to it, they can't quite put words to it. They're like, it's a feeling I have when I go to school. So I don't know if it's the number of kids, if they were already prone to some social anxiety, because some
yeah.
of the kids I didn't know pre-pandemic, so I'm not sure what they were like then. But it seems to have come out of nowhere, and when we have adolescents, I talk about it as an adjustment disorder. If I'm diagnosing, I tend to try to stick with adjustment disorder rather than give them straight anxiety or straight depression, because that sticks with them on their medical records. But I would say I've seen that more from adults. I have one kiddo, complete introvert, like did the CDL, so the committed distance learning, so never went to school all last year. Claimed that they thrived on it, loved it, although no schoolwork was getting done. But from a social aspects, claimed they loved it. Didn't see this person for a few months, and then I just had dad reach out the other day and say, we thought we'd be bringing her back, but she's really doing quite well. She's like, and this was a kiddo that was going through an identity, questioning identity and things like that during this period too, was doing a lot of online research. So, I was just kind of walking through that process with them. And then, thought that the return to school might be, really challenging, but actually has adapted really well, is involved in extracurriculars, is doing the work. And, so something, I don't know, somewhere along the way clicked. Totally didn't see that coming either. Thought it would be a challenge and hasn't been. So I don't know. It's really hard to say. So are there people that have responded the way you described? Yes. That's why it's so important, right, to treat them all individually, because no two people that have come in have been the same at all.
Mm-hmm.
You have a follow-up thought on that?
It's I just feel I guess it is maybe more, I don't know, more prevalent among adults, but I feel like for some people it's just like has simplified things, and if they're, I guess, more comfortable with less direct contact with a lot of people, I could see where it's just easier to stay in that mode, and it can be causing a lot. It can cause a lot of anxiety to like get back out and interacting more with people in person,
Yeah.
and I guess, yeah, I think it's maybe if they were already feeling some of that social anxiety.
Yeah. So Peter, I guess what I'm thinking is, from a clinical standpoint, I would be looking at them saying, what were they like pre-pandemic?
Mhm.
There was a lot of social anxiety prior to the pandemic, right? It comes down to, in a clinical setting, are they functional or dysfunctional?
Mhm.
Are they still going about all the things they need to do? Are they, getting work done, or are they getting schoolwork done? Are they meeting whatever the reasonable expectations are? If they're doing all of that, to look at them and say, oh, this is pathological, or this isn't working for them, is an outside judgment on them. But if it looks more like a regression of sorts, of like, well, I was pretty social, I had 3 close friends, and now I'm not seeing any of those friends, and I'm really just only going out to get the mail, or I'm only going out to, then I'd look at it a little bit differently and be like, hey, you know what? I know it might feel really comfortable, but what happened to the person that used to engage with 3 close friends and went out to dinner once a week? You know what I'm saying? So you really have to look at it in context of the person's whole personality and lifestyle. But yeah, there are some people that are perfectly, even if we're talking things like personality disorders, there are, I think it's schizotypal personality disorder, or there's one of them that, like, it's actually, even though it's a diagnosable condition, that's just how they are, and that fits their life, and they don't see any desire to change, nor is there a need for them to change. So diagnosable, yes, but are they doing okay? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of us might look at it and be like, but so it's really a hard thing to ask. But I would look at, what were they doing pre, and what was their level of satisfaction in life?
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed? Has that gone down at all? Are they just saying, I feel more comfortable because the anxiety is so overwhelming that I don't want to say it's not good?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That making sense?
Yeah, I think so. Sure. Do you have any thoughts in terms of competition and tournaments? And are there, I don't know, are there ways to make tournaments less anxiety producing or less stressful? That, I mean, I guess if we could do that, would you advise us to do that?
I think the things that cause anxiety at tournaments are going to be the same things that cause anxieties in life. Um, being in front of people, having to speak out in front of people, being in a crowd of people, wanting to share my views, but worrying about what other people are going to think. I mean, I'm going to step outside of a clinical standpoint here for a second and go into maybe kind of a mixture of clinical personal, but yeah, I'll be in clinical. Okay. When I'm working with people with anxiety, again, we're not working on how to avoid it. We're working on how to go through it.
Mm.
So for kids that have willingly, voluntarily, signed up for speech and debate, that is the nature of speech and debate. Now, can we break that down for them in any way to make it more manageable chunks? Yes, we can, right? We can have them practice at home in front of the mirror. We can have them videotape and show it and work through it that way. We can have them, maybe have 5 friends over and practice in front of the friends. The kids, my students are petrified of performing in front of their parents. They'd much rather go to a tournament and perform than have to show their parents what they're doing. Which makes me wonder about home. But so, what are we going to do to break it down and make it manageable for them? And usually, I mean, you and I probably know this the best, that, you throw them into a tournament and they're kind of like, okay, I get it. I got it now. I did it because I didn't have a choice because I was there, but now I got it. And okay, now I know what to expect, because I can preach to them all day long about what to expect. And they're like, yeah. I say it's a high school varsity sport. It's like you're going onto the football team and you're going to play and everyone's watching. And they're like, sure, Mrs. Chubb. And then they get there and they're like, oh, okay, I got it.
I mean, this is slightly related, but one of the things that I wish that we would do in Ohio is have judge disclosure, or at least disclosure of results by the tournament. And I feel like it just causes stress unnecessarily that we keep students in the dark about whether they're winning or losing throughout the tournament. And I don't know that it's like debilitating at all, but I think it would enhance the experience and help alleviate some of that stress if they just knew where they stood as the tournament progressed.
See, I tend to think the opposite. And again, it's going to all come down to the kid. A lot of the kids that I work with on my team tend to be all or nothing kids. Like, they're very worried about trying something and not being highly successful, because they're generally highly successful in other areas in their life. So I think if they got there and they saw that, like, they lost the first round, they might be done. You know what I'm saying? So again, it comes down to the kids. But
yeah, I agree. I definitely have a kid that if he misses one problem on a short quiz, he will punch himself in the head and say that he's stupid and why can't he get this?
Yep. Which, maybe these are the extremes, or, we don't want to look at this as the norm. But on the other hand, it's, I've got another kiddo that got to I don't even think she competes anymore. She got to the end of one tournament, and it was a fairly, she did really well her first tournament, came in first time, came in first, went to another tournament, came in 4th or 5th, and complete meltdown, right? So you just don't know how they're going to react, but some kids might feel better knowing how they're doing, and some kids don't. But it's one of those things, I guess we have our rules and we make it a blanket rule, and then we do our best as coaches to educate the kids on here's how it is. It's this way for every kid. You have to go into each round thinking, if I know what I did, or I think I know what I did not so well last round, I'm going to try to do better on that this round. Or if I nailed it last round, I'm just going to try to replicate it, right? But have that conversation about them. But the point is, right now the rules are you don't know, so you just go into each one thinking it's my next opportunity to do well, to do the best I can. So maybe that comes down to us and how we work with them and present it and educate them on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we if we change the standard, I mean, if we change the policy, we would adjust and they would adjust
Yep,
in
exactly.
time.
Exactly.
But it's just like, in basketball, like every shot you take, if it went in or if it didn't go in, and at the end of every quarter, if you're winning or you're losing,
Yep.
and you keep, you have that information to work with in terms of making adjustments. And
Yeah.
we would never have kids play a basketball game and not know the score until the very end, and then you get to find out what how you did at that point.
Yeah, that's true. Again, I don't think there's any blanket thing for everybody. We have to, whatever the rules are, I guess we're just gonna have to help them adjust. Yeah. All right. Well, that's all I've got.
Natalie, thanks again for agreeing to do this session. I wholeheartedly believe this is a session everyone should watch, especially from seeing what I've seen in the classrooms through summer camp, because I teach in a K-8 building and then I coach in a high school, and some of the behaviors and the issues the kids are struggling with. I think everyone kind of needs to take a step back and look at ways we can best help the kids move forward this year.
Yep, definitely. So I was happy to do it. Again, if anyone has questions, they're free to reach out to me and ask, and I'm happy to follow up. So